The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty park as Thomas rummaged through another trash bin. His stomach had been empty for 2 days now, and the gnawing hunger was getting harder to ignore. But he wasn't looking for food. He was searching for bottles and cans that he could trade for a few coins at the recycling center. Thomas had learned the routine well over the past 8 months of living on the streets. The early morning hours were best for finding recyclables before the city workers emptied the bins. His weathered hands, once skilled at operating heavy machinery on construction sites, now carefully sorted through garbage with the precision of someone whose survival depended on finding value in what others threw away. The park was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic beginning to pick up as the city woke up. A few joggers passed by, their expensive running shoes hitting the pavement in steady rhythms. They didn't look his way. People rarely did anymore. Thomas had grown used to being invisible, just another piece of the urban landscape that most preferred not to see. His shopping cart, salvaged from an abandoned grocery store parking lot, was already half full with bottles and cans when he approached the last bin near the playground. As he lifted the heavy lid, something caught his eye. There, sitting on top of a pile of fast food wrappers and coffee cups, was a brown leather wallet. Thomas glanced around the empty park before carefully picking it up. The leather was soft and expensive, the kind of wallet that probably cost more than he used to spend on groceries in a month when he had a steady job. His hands trembled slightly as he held it, not from the cold morning air but from the weight of possibility it represented. For a moment, he just stared at it. 8 months ago, finding a wallet would have been simple. He would have checked for identification and either turned it in to the police or tried to contact the owner directly. But 8 months ago, he had a home, a job, and 3 meals a day. 8 months ago, he wasn't counting quarters to see if he could afford a cup of coffee. The wallet felt heavy in his hands, heavier than leather, and whatever was inside should weigh. Thomas knew that weight. It was the weight of temptation, of desperation, of all the sleepless nights he'd spent wondering how his life had fallen apart so quickly. He remembered the accident like it was yesterday. The scaffolding had given way on the construction site and he'd fallen 20 feet onto concrete. The injury to his back had healed mostly, but the medical bills had been crushing. Even with insurance, the costs had piled up faster than his paychecks could handle. When he couldn't work for 3 months, everything had unraveled like a sweater with a pulled thread. First went the car, then the apartment, then the friends who had slowly stopped returning his calls. Pride had kept him from asking for help until it was too late. And by then there was no safety net left to catch him. Now, holding this wallet, Thomas felt the familiar ache in his chest that came with remembering better times. His stomach cramped with hunger, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since finding half a sandwich behind a deli 2 days ago. The recycling center wouldn't open for another 3 hours, and even then, his cart full of bottles might earn him enough for a small meal at the dollar menu. Thomas took a deep breath and opened the wallet. The first thing he saw made his heart race. Cash. More cash than he'd seen in months. He counted it quickly, his fingers moving through the bills with the practiced speed of someone who had once handled money regularly. $800. $800 that could solve every immediate problem he faced. He could get a motel room for a week, maybe 2 if he found somewhere cheap. He could eat real meals, hot meals instead of scraps and whatever free samples he could find at the grocery store. He could buy clean clothes, take a proper shower, maybe even start looking presentable enough to apply for jobs again. But as his eyes moved past the money, he saw the driver's license tucked behind a clear plastic window. The photo showed an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The name read Harold Whitman, age 78. The address was in Riverside District, the fancy part of town where Thomas had once done construction work on some of the big houses. Thomas studied the photo for a long moment. The man looked like someone's grandfather, the kind who probably had pictures of grandchildren in his wallet and stories about the old days. The kind of man who might be frantically searching for this wallet right now, worried not just about the money, but about all the irreplaceable things people keep in their wallets. Thomas flipped through the other contents. Credit cards, a medical insurance card, a pharmacy loyalty card, and tucked in the back, a small photo of an elderly woman with the same kind eyes as the man in the license. She was wearing a wedding dress from what looked like decades ago, and on the back someone had written, "Martha, our wedding day, 1968 in faded blue ink." The photo hit Thomas harder than the money had. This wasn't just a wallet full of cash and plastic cards. This was someone's life, someone's memories, someone's connection to the people and moments that mattered most to them. Losing this wallet would mean losing that precious photo, and Thomas knew that no amount of money could replace something like that. He thought about his own mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She had always been the moral compass of their small family, the one who insisted on doing the right thing even when it was hard. Character, she used to say, is what you do when nobody's watching. She had lived by those words, working 2 jobs to raise him after his father left, never taking shortcuts or looking for the easy way out. Thomas could almost hear her voice now, gentle but firm, reminding him that hard times didn't change what was right and what was wrong. The money in this wallet wasn't his, no matter how desperately he needed it. It belonged to Harold Whitman, and somewhere in the city a 78-year-old man was probably worried sick about losing his wallet. The decision wasn't easy. Every practical part of Thomas's mind screamed at him to take the money and walk away. Nobody would know. The wallet had been thrown away, abandoned in a trash bin where anyone might have found it. He could tell himself that finders keepers was a real rule, that he deserved a break after 8 months of sleeping under bridges and eating from garbage cans. But as he looked again at the photo of Harold and Martha on their wedding day, Thomas knew what he had to do. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, and despite everything he'd been through, despite how far he'd fallen, he was still her son. He was still the man she had raised to do the right thing. Thomas closed the wallet and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the pocket closest to his heart. The money would have solved his problems, at least temporarily, but keeping it would have created a different kind of problem. It would have changed him into someone his mother wouldn't recognize, someone he didn't want to become. The address on the license was across town, in a neighborhood where the bus routes didn't run frequently, and the houses sat behind iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges. Getting there would take most of the day and the last of his money for bus fare. But as Thomas pushed his cart toward the recycling center, planning the journey across the city to return a stranger's wallet, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since his world had fallen apart, he felt like himself again. Thomas counted the quarters in his palm 3 times before he was sure. $2.75. It was barely enough for bus fare across the city, and it meant he wouldn't be eating today either. But as he felt the weight of Harold's wallet in his jacket pocket, he knew there was no other choice. The recycling center had given him $4.20 for his morning's work. He'd spent $1.50 on a cup of coffee and a stale donut at the gas station, leaving him with just enough money to make the trip to Riverside District. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was spending his last coins to return $800 to a stranger. The first bus arrived 15 minutes late, packed with early commuters heading to their office jobs downtown. Thomas climbed aboard, dropping his quarters into the fare box as the driver barely looked up from his newspaper. The bus was crowded, and Thomas found himself pressed against a window in the back, trying to make himself as small as possible. He caught his reflection in the glass and winced. 8 months on the streets had changed him more than he'd realized. His hair was longer and grayer than it used to be, and his face was weathered from sleeping outside in all kinds of weather. His clothes, donated from a church clothing drive, were clean but clearly secondhand. The jacket was too big and the pants were too short, giving him the unmistakable look of someone who was struggling. As the bus filled with more passengers at each stop, Thomas noticed how people reacted to him. A woman in a business suit took one look at him and moved to a seat farther away. A man in an expensive overcoat pulled his briefcase closer, when Thomas accidentally bumped into it as the bus turned a corner. Nobody made eye contact. It was like he'd become invisible, or worse, like he was something to be avoided. The bus ride downtown took 40 minutes, and Thomas had to transfer to another line to get to Riverside District. While waiting at the transfer station, he checked Harold's address again. The house was about a mile from the nearest bus stop, which meant a long walk through one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. The second bus was less crowded, and as they traveled farther from downtown, the passengers became fewer, and the buildings outside grew larger and more spread out. Thomas watched through the window as small apartments gave way to townhouses, then to larger homes with actual yards and driveways. When the bus finally reached his stop, Thomas was the only passenger getting off. The driver gave him a curious look as he stepped down onto the sidewalk. This clearly wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people arrived by public transportation, especially people who looked like Thomas. The difference was immediate and striking. Instead of cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences, there were smooth concrete walkways and perfectly maintained lawns. The houses weren't just bigger, they were works of art, with architectural details and landscaping that probably cost more than Thomas used to make in a year. As he walked down the tree-lined street, checking house numbers against the address in Harold's wallet, Thomas became increasingly aware of how much he stood out. A woman working in her garden stopped watering her flowers to stare at him. A man washing his car in his driveway watched Thomas pass with obvious suspicion. At the corner of Maple and Elm, a jogger in expensive athletic gear actually crossed the street to avoid him. Thomas understood why. In a neighborhood where everyone belonged, where everyone looked prosperous and secure, he was clearly an outsider. His appearance told a story that made people uncomfortable, a reminder that not everyone in the city was doing well. The house numbers were getting closer to Harold's address, but Thomas was beginning to feel like he was walking through a museum exhibit rather than a real neighborhood. Everything was too perfect, too clean, too protected from the reality of the world outside these manicured streets. When he stopped to check the address again, a police car slowly pulled up beside him. The officer rolled down his window and looked Thomas up and down with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot trouble. "Can I help you with something?" the officer asked, his tone polite but firm. Thomas felt his heart rate increase. He'd had a few encounters with police since becoming homeless, and while most had been respectful, there was always an underlying tension. He was acutely aware that he looked out of place in this neighborhood, and that his presence was clearly making people nervous. "I'm looking for someone," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I found something that belongs to them and I'm trying to return it." The officer studied him for a moment longer. "What's the address?" Thomas told him, and the officer nodded toward the end of the street. "That's about 4 blocks down. You walking there?" "Yes, sir. Everything okay? You need any help?" There was something in the officer's tone that made Thomas think he was genuinely concerned, rather than suspicious. "I'm fine, thank you. Just trying to do the right thing." The officer seemed to consider this, then nodded. "All right. You have a good day." He rolled up his window and drove away, but Thomas noticed he turned at the next corner, probably to circle back and keep an eye on the situation. As Thomas continued walking, he passed more people who stopped what they were doing to watch him. A woman walking her small dog quickly turned and headed in the opposite direction. 2 teenagers on bicycles slowed down to stare at him before pedaling away quickly. An elderly man checking his mailbox went back inside his house, and Thomas saw him watching through the window. The attention was making Thomas increasingly uncomfortable, but he pushed forward. He'd come too far to turn back now, and Harold was probably worried about his wallet. The photo of Harold and Martha on their wedding day kept coming back to Thomas's mind. That picture alone was worth more than any amount of money to someone who had lost the person they loved. Finally, Thomas reached 1247 Elmwood Drive. The house was different from what he'd expected. While still clearly expensive and well-maintained, it was smaller and more modest than many of the other homes in the neighborhood. It was a single-story ranch style with a neat front yard and a simple wooden porch. There were flower boxes under the windows and a bird feeder hanging from a small oak tree. Thomas stood at the end of the driveway for a moment, gathering his courage. Now that he was here, he realized he was nervous about how Harold would react. Would the old man be grateful, or would he be suspicious of Thomas's motives? Would he think Thomas was trying to scam him somehow? As he walked up the front path, Thomas noticed the details that spoke of someone who took care of their home despite their age. The walkway was swept clean, the porch furniture was arranged neatly, and there were no weeds in the flower beds. This was clearly the home of someone who took pride in their surroundings. Thomas took a deep breath and climbed the 3 steps to the front door. There was a doorbell, but also an old-fashioned brass knocker. He chose the doorbell and waited, his heart pounding as he heard footsteps approaching from inside. This was it. After a morning of searching through trash, a long journey across the city, and a walk through a neighborhood where he clearly didn't belong, Thomas was about to meet Harold and return his wallet. He hoped the old man would understand that sometimes good things happened, even in a world that often felt unfair and harsh. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door, and Thomas heard the sound of a deadbolt being turned. The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly man leaning heavily on a silver walker. Harold looked exactly like his driver's license photo, but older and more fragile than Thomas had expected. His white hair was neatly combed, and he wore a simple cardigan sweater over a button-down shirt. But what struck Thomas most were his eyes. They were the same kind eyes from the photo, though now they held a mixture of caution and confusion. Harold looked Thomas up and down, taking in his weathered appearance and second-hand clothes. His grip tightened on the walker, and Thomas could see the old man's shoulders tense. In this neighborhood, unexpected visitors who looked like Thomas usually meant trouble. "Can I help you?" Harold asked, his voice polite but guarded. He didn't open the door all the way. Keeping the chain lock engaged, Thomas felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. Now that he was face to face with Harold, he realized how this must look. A homeless man showing up at an elderly person's door in an expensive neighborhood could easily be mistaken for someone with bad intentions. "Mr. Whitman," Thomas said, trying to make his voice sound as gentle and non-threatening as possible. "My name is Thomas. I found something that belongs to you." Harold's eyebrows raised slightly, but the caution remained in his expression. "What did you find?" Instead of answering with words, Thomas slowly reached into his jacket pocket. He made sure to move deliberately, not wanting to startle the old man. When he pulled out the brown leather wallet, Harold's entire demeanor changed in an instant. "Oh my goodness," Harold whispered, his eyes widening with relief and disbelief. "My wallet. Where did you find it?" "In a park downtown," Thomas said, holding it out toward the partially open door. "I think someone must have thrown it in a trash bin after taking what they wanted, but everything's still inside." Harold fumbled with the chain lock, his hands shaking slightly with excitement and relief. When he finally got the door open, he reached out to take the wallet with trembling fingers. Thomas noticed how frail the old man's hands looked, spotted with age and marked by years of living. "I can't believe it," Harold said, turning the wallet over in his hands, as if to make sure it was real. "I've been looking everywhere for this. I thought it was gone forever." Thomas watched as Harold opened the wallet and began checking its contents. The old man's face went through a series of emotions as he found each item exactly where it should be. When he got to the money, he stopped and looked up at Thomas with an expression of pure amazement. "The money's all here," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of it." "Of course it is," Thomas replied, though he understood why Harold was surprised. Most people would have taken the cash and thrown the wallet away. But when Harold reached the small photo of Martha tucked in the back, his composure finally broke. His eyes filled with tears as he carefully pulled out the faded picture of his young bride. He held it gently as if it might crumble in his fingers. "This is my wife, Martha," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She passed away 2 years ago. This is the only picture I carry of her from our wedding day. If I had lost this—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Thomas felt his own throat tighten with emotion. He'd been right about that photo being the most valuable thing in the wallet. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Whitman." Harold carefully placed the photo back in the wallet, then looked up at Thomas with tears still in his eyes. "You could have taken the money. $800 is a lot of cash. Most people would have kept it." Thomas shrugged, not sure how to explain his decision without sounding preachy. "It wasn't mine to take." "But you clearly—" Harold paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You look like you could use the money." There was no judgment in Harold's voice, just honest observation. Thomas appreciated that the old man was acknowledging his situation without being condescending about it. "I could," Thomas admitted, "but my mother always taught me that being poor doesn't give you an excuse to be dishonest. Some things are more important than money." Harold studied Thomas's face for a long moment, as if trying to understand what kind of person would walk across the city to return money he desperately needed. Finally, he stepped back from the door. "Please, come in," Harold said. "I insist, it's the least I can do." Thomas hesitated. He was aware of how he must smell after spending months on the streets, and he didn't want to make Harold uncomfortable in his own home. "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Harold said firmly. "You've done something extraordinary for me. The very least I can do is offer you a cup of coffee and something to eat." The mention of food made Thomas's empty stomach clench with hunger, but he still hesitated. "Are you sure? I mean, I haven't exactly—" When did you last have a proper meal? Harold asked gently. Thomas thought about it. 2 days ago, I think. Found half a sandwich behind a deli. Harold's expression softened even further. Then it settled. Come in, please. I was just about to make lunch anyway. Thomas followed Harold into the house, immediately struck by how warm and inviting it felt. The furniture was comfortable but not flashy, and every surface held small mementos and photographs that spoke of a life well lived. The walls were covered with pictures of Harold and Martha at different stages of their lives together. Their wedding, vacations, holidays with family, quiet moments at home. Your home is beautiful, Thomas said, meaning it sincerely. Martha decorated it, Harold replied, making his way slowly toward the kitchen with his walker. I haven't changed much since she's been gone. Somehow it feels like she's still here when everything stays the same. The kitchen was small but efficient, with a breakfast nook that looked out onto a backyard garden. Harold gestured for Thomas to sit at the small table, while he began moving around the kitchen with surprising efficiency. Despite his walker, coffee's already made, Harold said, pouring 2 cups from a pot that was clearly part of his daily routine. How do you take it? Black is fine, Thomas said, grateful for anything warm. As Harold prepared sandwiches, he kept up a gentle stream of conversation. He asked Thomas about how he'd ended up on the streets, and Thomas found himself telling the story of his construction accident and the medical bills that had destroyed his life. Harold listened without judgment, occasionally making sympathetic sounds or asking clarifying questions. I used to see homeless people and wonder why they didn't just get jobs, Harold admitted as he placed a turkey sandwich in front of Thomas. I'm ashamed to say I thought it was always their own fault somehow. Thomas took a bite of the sandwich and had to stop himself from eating too quickly. It was the first real food he'd had in days. Most people think that way. It's easier than admitting it could happen to anyone. Have you tried to get back on your feet? I mean, find work? Thomas nodded, swallowing another bite. It's hard when you don't have an address or clean clothes or a place to shower. Most employers take one look at you and make up their mind before you even speak. Harold poured himself more coffee and sat down across from Thomas. What kind of work did you do before? Construction, mostly. Heavy machinery operation, some carpentry. I was good at it too, before the accident. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Thomas eating gratefully while Harold seemed lost in thought. Finally, the old man reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet again. I want to give you a reward, Harold said, opening it to the cash. This money means nothing compared to what you've given back to me. Thomas shook his head. I can't take your money, Mr. Whitman. I didn't return your wallet for a reward. But you need it. You just told me you haven't eaten in 2 days. And tomorrow I'll figure out how to eat again. But if I take your money now, I won't be able to look at myself in the mirror. I did the right thing because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something in return. Harold stared at Thomas for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. It was as if he was seeing something in Thomas that surprised him, something he hadn't expected to find. You're a remarkable person, Thomas, Harold said quietly. I haven't met many people with that kind of integrity. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. I'm just trying to be the man my mother raised me to be. Well, Harold said, closing his wallet and putting it away. She raised you right. And I hope you'll consider coming back to visit an old man who doesn't get much company these days. As Thomas finished his sandwich and coffee, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since his life had fallen apart, he felt like a human being again. Harold had treated him with dignity and respect, had listened to his story without judgment, and had offered friendship without expecting anything in return. When it was time to leave, Harold walked him to the door, moving slowly with his walker but determined to see Thomas off properly. Thank you again, Harold said, extending his hand for a shake. What you did today restored my faith in people. Thomas shook the frail hand gently. Thank you for the meal and the conversation. It meant more than you know. As Thomas walked back down the tree-lined street toward the bus stop, he felt lighter somehow, despite still being homeless and hungry. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of returning a wallet would change both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas returned Harold's wallet, and something unexpected had happened. The lonely old man and the homeless construction worker had become friends. It started with Harold asking Thomas to stop by again, just to check on him. Then it became a regular thing. Every few days, Thomas would make the long journey across town to visit Harold. The old man always had coffee ready and usually insisted on making Thomas a sandwich or heating up some soup. They would sit in Harold's kitchen, looking out at the small garden, and talk about everything and nothing. Harold loved hearing stories about Thomas's construction days, about the buildings he'd helped create and the satisfaction of working with his hands. Thomas enjoyed listening to Harold's memories of his late wife Martha, their travels together, and the quiet life they'd built in their modest home. The house had become a refuge for Thomas, a place where he could feel human again. Harold never made him feel ashamed about his situation, never looked at him with pity or judgment. He treated Thomas like an old friend, which was exactly what he was becoming. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Thomas was helping Harold organize some boxes in the spare bedroom. The old man moved slowly with his walker, directing Thomas to move things here and there, mostly just enjoying the company and having someone to help with tasks that had become difficult for him. "That box there," Harold said, pointing to a heavy cardboard box on the closet shelf. "Could you bring that down? I've been meaning to go through those old papers for months." Thomas lifted the box down carefully. It was heavier than he'd expected, filled with what looked like business documents and certificates. As he set it on the bed, some papers spilled out and Thomas bent to pick them up. That's when he saw it. A framed certificate that had fallen face up on the floor. The heading read, "Whitman Industries, Founder and Chief Executive Officer," and below that, Harold's full name in elegant script. Thomas stared at it for a moment, not quite understanding what he was seeing. "Mr. Whitman," Thomas said slowly, holding up the certificate. "What's Whitman Industries?" Harold looked at the paper in Thomas's hands and sighed. For a moment he seemed older than his 78 years. Something I'd hoped we could avoid talking about for a while longer. Thomas felt confused. "I don't understand." Harold made his way over to his favorite chair and sat down heavily. "Thomas, there's something I haven't told you about myself. I was hoping it wouldn't matter, that we could just be two friends getting to know each other. But I suppose you were bound to find out eventually." The serious tone in Harold's voice made Thomas nervous. He sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the certificate. "What is it?" "Whitman Industries is a technology company," Harold said quietly. "I started it 43 years ago in my garage working on computer components. Over the years, it grew into something much bigger than I ever imagined it would become." Thomas looked down at the certificate again, reading it more carefully this time. The dates showed that Harold had been the CEO for over 4 decades. "How big?" he asked. Harold was quiet for a long moment, as if trying to figure out how to explain. "Very big, Thomas. The company employs about 50,000 people worldwide. We make components for computers, smartphones, medical devices. If you've used any kind of electronic device in the past 20 years, there's probably something we made inside it." The words weren't quite sinking in for Thomas. He'd known Harold was comfortable, but this sounded like something much more than comfortable. "So you were like the boss of a big company?" "I was the owner," Harold said gently. "I still am, actually, though I retired from day-to-day operations 5 years ago when Martha got sick. My nephew runs things now." Thomas set the certificate down on the bed and looked around the modest bedroom, trying to reconcile what Harold was telling him with the simple house they were sitting in. "But this place, it's nice, but it's not what I'd expect from someone who owned a big company." Harold smiled sadly. This was Martha's childhood home. Her parents left it to her when they passed away, and she never wanted to leave it. Said it was where all her best memories were made. I offered to buy us a mansion, a penthouse, whatever she wanted. But she was happy here, so I was happy here. The pieces were starting to come together in Thomas's mind, but he still couldn't quite believe what Harold was telling him. "Mr. Whitman, exactly how successful is your company?" Harold was quiet for so long that Thomas thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Forbes magazine says I'm worth about $2.8 billion. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He felt dizzy, like the room was spinning around him. "Billion? With a B?" Harold nodded, watching Thomas's face carefully. "I know it's a lot to take in." Thomas stood up and walked to the window, trying to process what he'd just learned. The man he'd been having coffee with, the lonely widower who made him sandwiches and enjoyed hearing stories about construction work, was one of the richest people in the world. "I don't understand," Thomas said, turning back to Harold. "Why didn't you tell me?"
Why are you living like this?
Living like what? Harold asked. Like a normal person. Like someone who doesn't have billions of dollars. Harold adjusted his position in the chair, wincing slightly as his arthritis flared up. Because I am a normal person, Thomas. Money doesn't change who you are inside. It just changes what other people think of you. Thomas felt a wave of emotions he couldn't quite identify. Confusion, certainly, but also something that might have been anger or hurt. When I returned your wallet, I had no idea. You let me tell you about being homeless, about struggling to eat, and you never said anything. Would it have mattered? Harold asked quietly. Would you have returned my wallet differently if you'd known I was wealthy? No, Thomas said immediately. Of course not. And would you have wanted to be my friend if you'd known about the money from the beginning? Thomas thought about that question seriously. He remembered all the people who had treated him differently once they learned about his situation. How his old friends had slowly disappeared when he could no longer afford to go out with them or help them when they needed it. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe, but it would have been different. Exactly, Harold said. For the past 3 weeks, you've treated me like just another person. You've shared your stories with me, laughed at my jokes, helped me around the house not because you wanted something from me, but because you genuinely liked spending time with me. Do you have any idea how rare that is for someone in my position? Thomas sat back down, still trying to wrap his head around everything. People treat you differently when they know about the money. Harold laughed, but there was no humor in it. Different doesn't begin to cover it. Everyone wants something. Business deals, investments, donations to their causes. People I thought were friends turned out to be just waiting for the right moment to ask for help with their mortgages or their kids' college tuition. Even my own family. He trailed off, shaking his head. That must be lonely, Thomas said. And he meant it. It is, Harold admitted. After Martha died, I realized that most of the people in my life were there because of what I could do for them, not because of who I was. You're the first person in years who's wanted to spend time with me just for the company. Thomas looked around the room again, seeing it with new eyes. The simple furniture, the family photos, the lived-in feeling of the house. It wasn't the home of someone trying to show off his wealth. It was the home of someone trying to hold on to something real. The day you returned my wallet, Harold continued, you could have taken that $800, and it wouldn't have even been a rounding error in my accounts. But you chose to walk across the city to return it to a stranger. You chose to do the right thing when you had every reason not to. That told me more about your character than anything else could have. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. I still would have returned it. Even knowing what I know now. I believe you, Harold said. And that's exactly why I want to tell you something else. Thomas looked up, wondering what other surprises Harold might have in store. I've been thinking a lot these past few weeks, Harold said. About my life, about what really matters, about what I want to do with the time I have left. And I've realized that meeting you wasn't just good luck. It was a sign. A sign of what? Harold leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with something Thomas hadn't seen before. A sign that there are still good people in this world, people who do the right thing even when it costs them. People who deserve a chance to succeed, if someone would just give them that chance. Thomas felt a flutter of something in his chest, but he wasn't sure if it was hope or fear. Mr. Whitman, what are you saying? Harold smiled, and for the first time since Thomas had met him, the old man looked truly happy. I'm saying that I think we can help each other, Thomas. I'm saying that sometimes the universe puts the right people together at exactly the right time. And I'm saying that your act of kindness 3 weeks ago is about to change both of our lives in ways you can't even imagine. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across Harold's garden, but inside the modest house on Elmwood Drive, two unlikely friends were about to discover that some friendships have the power to transform not just individual lives, but the world around them. 6 months later, Thomas stood in front of a mirror in his small but comfortable apartment, adjusting the tie Harold had helped him pick out. He still couldn't quite believe how much his life had changed since that morning when he'd found a wallet in a park trash bin. Harold had started slowly. First, he'd helped Thomas get back on his feet with the basics, a small apartment in a safe neighborhood, some decent clothes, and most importantly, a chance to clean up and present himself properly to potential employers. But Thomas had insisted on earning his way, refusing any handouts that felt like charity. I want to work for whatever you give me, Thomas had told Harold during one of their many conversations about the future. I need to feel like I'm earning my place in the world again. Harold had understood completely. Instead of just writing checks, he'd offered Thomas a job as his personal assistant and companion. The work was perfect for both of them. Harold needed help with daily tasks that had become difficult with his walker and advancing age, and Thomas needed a steady income and a chance to rebuild his confidence. But as the weeks passed, their relationship had evolved into something much deeper than employer and employee. Thomas had become Harold's closest friend, the son he'd never had, and the person who brought laughter and purpose back into his lonely days. The real transformation had started when Harold began sharing stories about his business philosophy and the principles that had guided him throughout his career. Thomas found himself fascinated by the challenges of running a large company, the responsibility of employing thousands of people, and the potential to make a positive impact on the world. You have a natural understanding of people, Harold had told him one evening as they discussed a problem the company was facing with employee satisfaction. You see things that others miss because you've been where they are. You understand what it's like to struggle, to feel invisible, to need someone to believe in you. That conversation had planted a seed that grew into something neither of them had expected. Harold began involving Thomas in more business discussions, asking for his perspective on company policies and employee relations. Thomas's insights, shaped by his experiences on the streets and his natural empathy for others, proved surprisingly valuable. It was Thomas who had suggested the idea that would change everything. You know what bothers me most about being homeless? Thomas had said during one of their talks. It's not just the hunger or the cold. It's how people stop seeing you as human. They look right through you like you don't exist. But most homeless people aren't lazy or addicted or crazy. They're just people who hit a string of bad luck and couldn't recover. Harold had listened intently as Thomas continued. What if there was a way to help people before they fell so far that they couldn't get back up? What if someone gave them the same chance you gave me? That conversation had led to months of planning, research, and careful preparation. Harold had decided to start a foundation, but not just any foundation. This would be different. It would be run by someone who understood the problems firsthand, someone who had lived the experience and could connect with the people they were trying to help. Thomas had protested at first. I don't know anything about running a foundation. I'm just a construction worker who got lucky. You're not just anything, Harold had replied firmly. You're a man who walked across a city to return money you desperately needed to a stranger you'd never met. You're someone who chose integrity over survival. That's exactly the kind of person who should be helping others. Now, as Thomas prepared for the foundation's official launch, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded him of his first day on a new construction site. The Second Chances Foundation would provide not just housing and job training for homeless individuals, but something even more important: dignity, respect, and the belief that everyone deserved another opportunity to succeed. The foundation's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of treating homeless people as problems to be managed, they would be treated as people with potential to be developed. The program would provide stable housing, job training, mental health support, and most importantly, ongoing mentorship to help people rebuild their lives completely. Harold had insisted that Thomas be the public face of the foundation, the director who would oversee its operations and speak about its mission. People need to see that change is possible, Harold had said. They need to see someone who has been where they are and made it to the other side. The launch event was being held at the city's most prestigious hotel, and Thomas knew that many of the city's most influential people would be there. A year ago, he would have been invisible to these same people. Tonight, he would be asking them to open their hearts and wallets to help others who were currently where he used to be. As Thomas walked into the hotel ballroom, he was struck by how different everything looked from this side of the equation. The same people who might have crossed the street to avoid him when he was homeless were now approaching him with respect and genuine interest in his story. Harold was already there, moving slowly through the crowd with his walker, introducing the foundation's mission to potential donors and supporters. When he saw Thomas arrive, his face lit up with pride and affection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold said when it was time for the formal presentation, "I'd like you to meet someone very special. Thomas is not just the director of our new foundation. He's also the person who taught me that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places." Thomas took the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, but his voice was strong and clear when he began to speak. 8 months ago, I was living under a bridge, searching through trash cans for bottles to recycle. I was hungry, cold, and convinced that the world had forgotten I existed. But I found something in that trash can that changed everything. Not just for me, but hopefully for thousands of other people who are struggling right now. He told the story of finding Harold's wallet, of the choice he'd made to return it despite his desperate circumstances, and of the friendship that had grown from that simple act of honesty. Harold could have just given me money and sent me on my way, Thomas continued, but instead he gave me something much more valuable. He gave me back my dignity. He saw me as a person worth investing in, worth believing in. Tonight, we're launching the Second Chances Foundation, because we believe that everyone deserves what Harold gave me, a chance to prove that they're more than their worst circumstances. The response was overwhelming. Before the evening was over, the foundation had raised over $2 million in initial commitments. More importantly, they had recruited dozens of volunteers and mentors who wanted to be part of the solution. As the event wound down, Thomas found himself standing with Harold on the hotel's outdoor terrace, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, he knew, were people sleeping under bridges and searching through trash cans just as he had been not so long ago. "Are you ready for this?" Harold asked quietly. Thomas thought about the question seriously. "I don't know if anyone's ever ready to try to change the world, but I know I have to try. Too many good people are out there struggling, thinking nobody cares whether they live or die." Harold nodded approvingly. "You know what I've learned in 78 years of life? The best things happen when good people refuse to accept that the world can't be better than it is." Over the following months, the Second Chances Foundation would grow beyond anything either of them had imagined. They would help hundreds of people find housing, jobs, and hope. They would change city policies about how homeless individuals were treated. They would inspire other foundations and programs across the country. But perhaps most importantly, they would prove that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could predict. Thomas often thought about that morning in the park, about the moment when he'd held Harold's wallet and made the choice between desperation and integrity. He had no way of knowing then that returning $800 to a stranger would lead to helping thousands of people rebuild their lives. As he settled into his office at the foundation's headquarters, Thomas kept Harold's original wallet on his desk as a reminder. Not the wallet itself, of course, but a photo of it that Harold had framed for him. Underneath the photo was a simple inscription that captured everything they'd learned together. Sometimes doing the right thing for one person changes the world for everyone. The homeless construction worker who had once been invisible to the world had become someone who made sure that no one else would have to be invisible again. And it all started with a simple choice to do what was right, even when no one was watching.